A pleasure to meet y'all at last, and welcome back once again to video games that are totally awesome. So, March 1st, 2025. I will say that we've certainly come quite a long way thus far, and going into our third month of the year now, I'm sure that things are slowly but surely beginning to look up. In my own favor or otherwise, I'm not exactly seeing anything that's considered wrongful or misleading at this point, so I can't quite say we're totally out of the blue of certain things here, because especially knowing the fact that snow still resides outside and colder temperatures are still a bit frequent. A few weeks do of course remain until the upcoming equinox settles in, so spring won't be here for a little while longer. Until then though, we might as well talk about something that has to do with rain, since we are getting towards that point. What better way to regard the term rain than to talk about one of the first masterpieces by the one and only Quantic Dream, Heavy Rain. Yeah, this title from all the way back in 2010, I always regard 2010 as being the best possible year that could have ever existed. And finding this gem amongst the many games that PlayStation Plus had to offer over the years, this was definitely one worth playing many times over. I mean, I've done it 3 times so far, and GWK over the years has had a good reason to showcase it on my channel. So you'll definitely see a lot of Heavy Rain gameplay, if you look hard enough, that is. Anyways though, I might as well spend today talking a bit about Heavy Rain and how, well, it has influenced me over the years. First of all, since this was one of the first Quantic Dream games to become a big masterpiece for the time, it certainly had a lot of potential in its own storyline, its cast, and its unique twists and turns. Probably one of the biggest elements that has certainly become more prevalent in all of the Quantic Dreams games was its usage of point-and-click like elements. And while this technically was what I could say was the next best thing to Telltale games, especially because they didn't exactly live that much longer than we anticipated. Think about it. Telltale could have probably lived up until this very point, and they could have had a lot of money put out on other franchises. Imagine if they made an entire game based off of well-known franchises that are very popular today. I mean, there probably aren't that many examples that I could showcase here, because I'm sure not many would want to even think about the many decision-making elements that were very common around the days of Telltale, carrying over to more modern franchises. I mean, imagine Bluey, for instance. Yeah, probably not a good idea, right? So I guess it was better that Telltale just left most of the stuff well enough alone, whereas Quantic Dream carried on, mostly with the original stuff, thankfully. Anyways though, Heavy Rain was in fact a unique piece, and 15 years later, it still is rather captivating to watch. Whether it's from other people's walkthroughs or even my own gameplay experience over the years, especially dating as far back to when the game was first released on PlayStation Plus as a remaster in 2016. So it took 6 years to get a nice remaster for PlayStation 4 as well as 5 players like myself. I almost do wonder if they are going to have it updated on a performance scale, like have higher hertz or FPS range levels. But I guess those are elements that we might have to expect later on. Considering the fact though that there have been some PS5 upgrades of games like Dragon Ball Z Kakarot, Until Dawn, and I even hear that Days Gone is actually going to be getting a PS5 remake, but mostly on a graphical level. Even Dead Rising has its own PS5 remake, known as Dead Rising Deluxe Remastered. So when you think about it, the idea of Heavy Rain carrying over to PS5 players with all the unique graphical and performance capabilities that the console itself is known to generate, how well could it fare compared to most of the others so far? But that's probably not too important right now, because after all, I've talked a lot of stuff so far. Heavy Rain, of course, story-wise, is a pretty unique piece. After all, it centers on a kidnapped child in which that his father was unfortunately not quite good in being responsible enough to keep his kids safe. Yeah, I said kids, because while he does have one child now, he actually had a second one before then. The opening scene of the game takes place inside the Mars household. You can see Sean Mars rising up out of bed, in which that various controller prompts tell you to get him up out of bed, kind of like controlling a marionette, if you will, which is a little funny. Imagine if there's strings hovering over his body, indicating where the button mashing should indicate which limbs he should be raising next. Yeah, it's starting to sound a bit creepy, I know. Anyways, though, he gets ready for a number of things. Most importantly, a birthday party. Yeah, basically speaking, the house does need to get settled on, because while he does get up out of bed, take a shower, get dressed, and then get on down in order to go to his office and work, as he is an architect for a living, the game does in fact give you a variety of different controller positionings as well as movements. You can shake the controller, use the touchpad, move around with the sticks, tilt it like you're steering a wheel sort of. There's a variety of different controller functions that were certainly well used over the course of Quantic Dreams games. And when you think about it, there's a good amount of games that do also carry over to this sort of multifunctional controller design. Look at how Astrobot has evolved over the years. Nowadays, with PS5 players like myself, the latest Astrobot installment that came out last September really does allow for such a huge variety of different controller functions. Not just with the touchpad, or shaking, or vibrating, or steering, or rocking. Anything of the sorts. Anything you could possibly ever dream of utilizes all of these known functionalities that the PS5 controller is known to work with. Anyways, though, when the rest of the family does get home, there's a special scene that takes place outside in the backyard. Basically, Ethan, as well as his two sons, both get together for some playtime with each other, even participating in what we know as a LARP session, or live action roleplay. They basically pretend that they're pirates, and the soundtrack, believe it or not, does cue us into a pretty unique sailor score. Yeah, straight out of Pirates of the Caribbean, though not exactly directly ripped off from them. But hey, it's a simple little change in tone that, while it doesn't completely change things up, there are other games that actually do follow this sort of adventure storyboard. This kind of style is rather common nowadays. And we do see games that utilize the sort of live action roleplay element and actually bring it to life. Yeah, remember Life is Strange True Colors, for instance? An entire scene of the game that lasts for about 1 hour takes place as a special LARPing event. Yeah, I'll probably talk about that some other time. But of course, it carries on over, because it's not just the birthday that happens in the house, but they also go to the local shopping mall, in which that a clown sells balloons, Ethan buys one, but unfortunately he loses track of his son, whom is supposedly holding the balloon, and that's how Ethan could tell where he's at. Unfortunately, though, by the time Ethan does catch up to him, he ends up on the road. And even worse, a car hits him, and the balloon just floats away. Yeah, it's kind of like what happened in Pet Sematary, you know? When Miko Hughes was run by a truck, the kite flies away, and now we have a balloon flying away. So, you could understand the similarity between those scenes. Still, though, the poor guy gets hit by a car, and you could say that's one way to kick off a game, you know? But to be fair, there's plenty of other games that I've talked about over the years that do unfortunately start off pretty bad in the beginning. Sometimes just after the beginning even. I mean, Pixar's Up is definitely one of the best ways to ever possibly start off with a sad note. But hey, after the title screen, credits, and all that, the game was directed by David Cage. The cast stars Pascal Langdale as Ethan, Sam Douglas, as well as a variety of other actors whom portrayed the characters in the game. There, of course, are the writers, directors, animators, etc. Before we finally cut to an old apartment. Yeah. Sean Mars, the second son of Ethan, unfortunately, is all he has. Because, unfortunately, we could say that his wife had left him. Yeah, that's how bad the incident was. It got so bad that they practically divorced, sold the house for a crappy apartment, and on top of all that, we basically have Ethan and Sean trying to hopefully get things together. Of course, while we do get ourselves home into this apartment here, the whole game does situate us with a real life scenario. Ethan Mars, a father of Sean, is now left to take care of him alone. Basically, his wife now, if you will, did leave a note for him to take care of Sean, to get him fed, get his homework done, and then get him up to bed. You do have a variety of different things to work with here. Sean, of course, can sit on the couch, watch TV, and you can call on him and have him do homework or then have his meal, which, of course, has multiple choices in and of themselves. There's definitely a lot of games that have all these different choices to make and all these different decisions to make. So, you could definitely see where this game is taking us here. There's a lot of things to work with, and it doesn't really give off any sort of boredom here. I mean, you could give him orange juice, milk, or pizza, or salad, and whatnot. Oranges. You know, there's a good variety of things to choose from here. Of course, Sean and Ethan will interact with each other in many ways that actually do correlate to what a real life situation would be for a certain afternoon, for where if a father and son happen to be alone at home, pretty much. But then, of course, there finally comes the moment where Sean has to be put to bed. Yeah. They, of course, head on upstairs. Sean and Ethan talk things over before he turns in for the night. Ethan himself would follow closely behind. But let's not forget, this is only one of a handful of different character arcs that we get throughout the whole storyline here. As for the others, let's get to one of them. Because after this part, we get an up-close shot of someone's face. Yeah. A middle-aged man, wouldn't you know? It's kind of weird when you think about it. But actually, it's meant to be the loading screen, just as a means to let you know what other character you're going to play as. Yeah, it's one of those games where you have multiple characters to work with. If Dragon Ball Z wasn't enough, Thomas and Friends wasn't enough, or anything else like that wasn't enough, we got Heavy Rain situating you with, get this, 4 playable protagonist characters. Yeah, they're all protagonists. But we'll get back to that in a bit. Anyways, though, this next guy whom we play as is apparently a private eye. And he essentially goes to the home of a certain woman. This woman in particular, she unfortunately ended up losing her child at some point to somebody known as the Origami Killer. And while she basically treats him like some sort of person wanting sexual actions, he does pay up, but not for the reasons that she's thinking. Instead, he's hoping to get some answers to some questions. He obviously claimed that he was a private eye to her, and that he was hired by the families of the Origami Killer's victims. So, what we have here is good old Lauren Winter. Yeah. She had apparently lost a child just like Ethan Mars did earlier in the game. So, it's a pretty dark situation to be in. Imagine living in such a broad city and you have all these things to work with, and then, boom, your life just changes before your very eyes. Because one man out there wants nothing more than bloodshed and violence. It ain't right, you know. Anyways, though, Lauren and Scott Shelby, as this private eye's name is, they basically do have a few questions and some answers put together, and hopefully they could wrap things up on a solid note. But let's just say that while Scott is told to leave, Lauren Winters will, believe it or not, become a more important factor in the story later on, though. This is where we get to, wouldn't you know, another protagonist character. This guy is known as Norman Jayden. Yeah. And wouldn't you know, he's FBI. And what's more, he has a unique augmented reality glasses and glove mixture. Yeah, apparently what this does is that this technological marvel at the time is made so that way he can actually figure out what clues are around and what he can look for in terms of getting closer to unraveling the mystery of the Origami Killer. And I feel like that while this scene also does showcase how the Origami Killer got his name, because every victim that he's slain, he left behind an origami figure. Yeah. Quite impressive, don't you think? It's a lot like how the Freeway Killer left his bodies along freeways in California. Or maybe there was the Killer Clown because the guy dressed up like a clown and lured people to his home where he strangled them to death. So it all comes around to the fact that the killer's nickname comes from whatever common theme runs around them during their time of crime. So at the end of the day, though, while Norman Jayden is able to survey this whole crime scene area and figure out exactly what went wrong at the time, this killer in particular was not only killing victims, he was basically creating a body count, possibly for a specific reason. And, well, let's just say, when we cut back to good old Ethan, guess what happens? He does take Sean over to the park after a long, hard day of school, but then Ethan unfortunately zones out, possibly reminiscing of the horrifying events that happened to his other son, when, wouldn't you know, the park unfortunately is empty now. Yeah, he basically goes over to try and find Sean, but he ain't even there. That's when things really start to kick into gear. Because now Ethan not only lost one son, but his other is missing. And he has to find him right away. Even this wife of his, I tell you what, man, Grace Mars, she was not only worried sick about Sean at the time, but man, is she really hostile towards Ethan. Like, sure, he might have accidentally left him behind and whatnot, but can you really blame him? He's gone through a lot of stuff. I mean, just think about it. Had that car not shown up on the road and run over the poor guy, I'm sure a lot of this wouldn't even be happening. I'm sure that a lot of morality would have truly washed over Ethan and allowed him to simply not feel the pain of loss just like that. No, but really, it's true. The Origami Killer probably got a hold of him. And what's worse is that Ethan now has to contend to, wouldn't you know, the media. Yeah. But then, of course, there comes along a certain riddle that the Origami Killer leaves for him. Because it's a 5-phase challenge that he has to deal with. You see, the Origami Killer not only kidnapped Sean Mars, but he also placed him captive in some sort of old abandoned warehouse, sitting underneath the rain. Yeah, the roof was basically torn open, and this grate that has Sean inside of, the thing is, Sean's unable to get out of there because of how tall the grate is nonetheless. And what's worse is that because the rain is coming down, you know what's going to happen? The pits that Sean's in is going to get filled up with water. Wow. That is crazy. But really, this is basically a life or death situation for poor Sean. And Ethan has to do something about it. And you know what he does? He goes on a quest to find his son, but at the same time, acknowledging the Origami Killer's demands. The Origami Killer basically leaves behind a few different challenges in a shoebox in which that Ethan has to go over to a local station and set up lockers to find this box in particular. Once he gets a hold of it, he opens it up and finds 5 origami figures inside. Well, that's not all, right? There's a loaded gun as well. It apparently does play a critical role later on. That's probably why the killer left it there, knowing Ethan might try to hunt him down or something. But really, the gun's bullets, they're meant for something different. We'll get back to that though. Of course, we also can't forget to mention the 4th playable character known as Madison Page, a local reporter whom is also covering the many travesties surrounding the Origami Killer and the many horrible things he's done. But of course, it all comes down to these 4 characters. You have Ethan Mars, whom is on a quest to go find his son and doing whatever it takes to make it happen. You have Madison Paige, covering the many events and infiltrating a lot of different locations that the Origami Killer is known to be affiliated with. You have Norman Jayden of the FBI, using his own sense of crime-solving skills as a means to get closer to the Origami Killer. And finally, there's Scott Shelby, whom is later accompanied by Laura Winter. And Lauren is probably more or less just an accomplice or sidekick in the matter, in order for Scott to basically hone his own skills in order to find out what is going on out there. He has his own office. He's a PI. But like I said, that will be critically important later on. So, let's just explain everything here until the very end of the game, okay? So, Ethan's got 5 things he needs to do. He needs to go find a car that has been in storage for a while. He needs to go drive on the opposite side of the highway, avoiding all traffic while he does so. And go to a similar amount of distance, and the Origami Killer will basically label out the name of an address, but a small bit at a time. Once Ethan completes all 5 challenges, the Origami Killer basically reveals the full address that Ethan can go to find Sean. That's basically the written demand that we have here, the ransom, if you will, that goes in. Instead of asking for money, he asks for Ethan to put himself through a lot of BS just to find his son. Man, imagine if my boys got kidnapped and I have to do a lot of crazy stuff like base jumping, bungee jumping, swimming down to the bottom of the ocean, or punching a hole through my TV. All that just to find Chew and Cray. Yeah, the very same Choo and Kramer that have been on this channel for a pretty long time. In any case though, I'll have to admit, Ethan's storyboard alone is pretty interesting because all the efforts that he puts himself through just to eventually find Sean Mars after completing all 5 of the trials, yeah, they were all pretty bad. The fact that he had to shoot someone, the fact that he had to go through an electrical plant, the fact that he had to drive on the highway, the fact that he had to, put himself through a lot of questionable or even life or death situations. It's almost alluding to the sort of nature that the Saw films have given us, the idea of torture. But in this case, this is more of Ethan voluntarily putting himself through all of this in an effort to redeem himself. He didn't do such a great job as a father. He barely kept track of his other son, and look what happened. He ended up roadkill. As for Sean, he practically allowed for him to be kidnapped and put off in some isolated location, possibly about to drown. But hey, don't take my word for it. I might as well discuss the other storyboards at hand, but I might as well mention something real quick, because there is actually one major trope that actually occurs in the game in which that it can highly affect the rest of the storyline. Yeah, I bet you didn't know that there are some sequences in which a lot of quick time actions are indeed present. There's some fighting involved, there's some gunplay involved, there is some escapism involved as well, and if you don't take it up as quickly as possible or react to it in time, there's a good chance that any one of the main characters might end up dead. Yeah, and there's a pretty ominous sting that shows up in the background. The composer for the soundtrack really did give us the feeling of true defeat. How we failed to keep these characters alive. But I will say in my experiences, having had a lot of experience with quick time actions, I was more than fortunate to actually not slip up in most of these things. And while there might have been occasions where I might fumble, it's a bit rare when you think about it. But I will say there's lots of other scenes that might as well be talked about. Other than all of Ethan's tropes in his own storyboard in an effort to find Sean Mars, you have Madison Paige, who, for instance, goes into a local nightclub, but in order to be invited into the special room by a guy in charge, she has to do something special for him. Basically, she modifies her clothes to appear much more sexier for him. And upon being invited to his room, she actually uses him to get information on what was going on. Because apparently this guy in particular was in fact affiliated with the Origami Killer. And as a result, she basically demanded that he tell her what he knows about the disappearances of young Sean, about the Origami Killer's known presence as well as his origin. There's also Scott Shelby, whom, like I said, you have Lauren Winter accompanying him throughout his leg of the journey. It eventually gets so rough at one point, between the times that he and Lauren basically hung out in his office to cooking some scrambled eggs one time, and eventually they make way to a manor where a party is being held. Apparently, there was the old man, who was the father of a guy who was in charge of a construction company. And he actually, believe it or not, suffers from a condition. And Shelby basically watches him. You actually, believe it or not, have the option to give him his pills before he kicks the bucket. And both times, I went ahead and did give him the pills. Yeah, 2 different times I played through the game, and I didn't really bother to see what would have been like if he didn't get the pills. Chances are it would have been pretty disturbing, much like a few other things that happened in the game. And let's not forget, this is the very same Shelby who was able to escape from a car that was sinking underwater. And thankfully Lauren was close by. It was one epic shootout that occurred up until that very point. Then, of course, we have Norman Jayden. He, of course, is co-signed alongside Lieutenant Carter Blake as well as Captain Leighton Perry at the local police station. At first, he does make himself almost at home with a crappy office that he situates himself within. And through his augmented reality glasses and glove, he is actually able to connect himself with his own sort of office setting. And you do get the choice of a few different locations. You could have him in space, Mars, the ocean, the jungle. There's a nice selection of choices here and there. I mostly went with the Mars theme. After all, ain't that the planet we're supposed to colonize later on in life? But with all of these things that the likes of both Jayden, Paige, Shelby, and Mars, they basically all would eventually come together. A junkyard. Yeah. This old abandoned warehouse in which that Sean Mars is eventually found to be inside of, held hostage by the Origami Killer, and possibly about to drown. This can mostly be assured that if Ethan goes through all 5 of his trials successfully, and having had a lot of, let's say, time spent with Madison Paige, he does make his way over there to that very, very address that the Origami Killer provides for him. Oh, but on the other hand, you could have Madison Paige expose the address in particular by going into, wouldn't you know, Shelby's own hideout. Yeah. Even though this Shelby guy was seen as a private eye hired by the Origami Killer's victims' families, he actually had himself a bit of an ulterior motive. This PI initiative of his was merely just a guise, a means to blend himself in with society, and hopefully get a much closer inspection on many families of which that their children are seemingly endangered. And well, this whole entire idea of being hired by the families of the Origami Killer's victims is basically just a crazy ploy that he puts together. And this secret lab that he has inside of his own office that Madison Paige basically sneaks into and breaks into, it's a unique thing with loads of technology. Think about it. Shelby used to be a lieutenant for the police station, but he unfortunately had since left. There is actually a backstory in which that Shelby himself, believe it or not, in his younger years, he himself once had a brother, and his brother unfortunately ended up drowning while they were playing outside. their father unfortunately wasn't too helpful in the situation. Not even a bit. Didn't even bother to come after them, especially when Shelby ran back for help. So you could say this horrible traumatic experience of losing his own brother to a flood had basically instilled this sort of killer behavior in him. That's basically how Shelby decided to take up a life of crime and pretend to be a PI at the same time, just so he can pretty much get away with this stuff all the time. 8 people he's taken already. Yeah, that's a lot of lives that he's already claimed. Shawn Mars was his next target, and Paige basically got a first-hand look from deep inside that room of his. Unfortunately, Shelby does catch her in the act. And as for Jaden, well, he unfortunately is unable to file in a full-on report as to who the Origami Killer really is. You do actually get the option to pursue various different people, including Carter Blake. Yeah. Just because he was a jerk, you basically get the chance to get him back for all the crap that he put you through. But hey, it's a pretty bad idea. It's got a lot of repercussions. And Jaden isn't even playable for the rest of the game if Leighton Perry sends him out back to Washington. Yeah. This basically eliminates Jaden from the storyline, and Paige won't even get a chance to contact him for anything. Yeah. But hey, on the other hand, if you just leave it as is, Paige will eventually get the idea to either contact Ethan or Jaden and warn them about Shelby being the Origami Killer and where to find Shawn Mars. Of course, these characters will eventually come into contact with each other, including Shelby. Just think, this very same guy, we played him the entire time, and we were practically on the fence, assuming that he was good and all that. But apparently not so. A final battle is taking place where Ethan, Madison, or Jaden can actually fight against him. And depending on who's all there, depending on who's still alive, and depending on all that has been done thus far, it's one epic fight that happens on a conveyor belt, about to make its final stop to a big drop, leading into a ginormous mulcher. Yeah. This thing ain't a joke. One body falls in there, and it becomes instantaneously vaporized and turned into mush. So, these characters do have to engage in a lot of quick time events, once again, just to fight Shelby. And I will say it's fairly challenging for what it is. A successful beating means that Shelby is basically little more than massive pulpy piles left inside the machine. But unfortunately, any of our characters could undergo the same sort of problems. However, there is another version of the fight that takes place on top of a crane instead. And I would say that maybe if one of our characters dies at the hands of Shelby into the mulcher, then maybe Shelby could fight them in the crane and whatnot. I haven't really gotten that sort of thing into account there, because unfortunately you're only able to bring in one character at a time from Paige's perspective. She's only able to call either Ethan or Jaden. If Jaden finds out Shelby was the killer, or if Ethan finds out where Shawn Mars is, before anyone else basically understands the whole thing, then essentially it's what it is. You either get Ethan or Paige, Paige or Jaden, or there's also the idea that Paige unfortunately doesn't proceed, because either she will jump from the building, fatally wounding her, or she might burn to a crisp. Yeah, like I said, there's just a ton of variables that'll affect the story from the get-go. Anyways, though, with the victory against Shelby, you know what's going to happen? Shawn is going to be saved. Ethan's name is going to be cleared, as they originally had him accused of being the Origami Killer. Shelby is revealed to be the Origami Killer. Or, then of course, there could be the time where Shelby could get away with this, and the likes of Madison or Jaden will basically be either dead or anything of the sort. Jaden could be sent back to Washington. Yeah. There's a ton of endings in this sort of game. And I will say that on my first playthrough, what happened was that Ethan, unfortunately, is helpless. As in, Madison jumped from the building, and Shelby was able to cleanly get away with what he did. Sean is basically left to drown in the building, and Ethan is unfortunately sentenced to prison, with a ton of origami figures, eventually hanging himself in his own cell. And then, of course, there's also the ending where if Lauren survives or if Lauren dies, Shelby basically just walks through the city, possibly looking for another victim or to move on with his life. Lauren, of course, will shoot him when she finds out he's the origami killer. But then, of course, there comes the point where if Shelby dies, Lauren, whether she's dead or alive, what will happen is that she will spit on his grave and condemn him for what he's done. Secretly, that is. Ethan, of course, will eventually get a new start on life, in which Sean, as well as Grace, they'll all basically successfully move on from this whole thing, and they will, believe it or not, be in a much better position than they used to be before then. So you could talk about a nice happy ending that goes together with this sort of thing. Of course, Captain Leighton Perry will resign from the police department regardless of the circumstances in hand. And as for Jaden, well, there could be the time where either he dies and Carter Blake is given his augmented reality gear and he tries it out, seeing the amazing office that Jaden created. Then, of course, there comes the twist ending where Jaden appears in front of him. Either that's an augmented reality figure that he generated, or it's actually him standing there, alive and well. Possibly after the attack on Shelby, or whatever. But either way you look at it, like I've said, there's so many things that I could talk about here. So many things that I could probably put into a good perspective here. And all of this is still quite an amazing thing to put together. So, all in all, Heavy Rain is without a doubt a big masterpiece. That does deserve a lot of love, even today. I might even consider playing it through yet again. But for now, though, I can't quite say that it's going to be something that I will intend to do in the immediate future. In all seriousness, though, it's still a great game for what it is. Oh, but I might as well mention the DLC, which unfortunately didn't carry over to the newest version for the PS4. Yeah, there's basically a DLC where Madison Paige visits a taxidermy shop. Yeah, pretty freaky. Other than that, though, there's not much more I could say about this. In the end, with all the endings that I've made so far, 2 different playthroughs over the past several years, I'd say it's all worked out quite well. It's still a great game, one of the best of 2010. I'm kind of upset that I've missed out on that one. But it was an M-rated game in 2010. Obviously, I would not have been allowed to play that even on my best day. But for my overall rating on Heavy Rain, it deserves a good 8.7 out of 10.1. So not exactly on par with the likes of Detroit Become Human, but I might as well say there is actually a so-called missing link between the first masterpiece and the largest of all the masterpieces that Quantic Dream made. But this one does, like the other one, take place in a more contemporary environment, but a little while after the events of Heavy Rain. And while there's no characters that carry over to this other title, well, soon enough, I will eventually have to talk about 2013's Beyond Two Souls. Until then, though, if you want to see more, go down to my channel. Make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me wherever you can find me, and stay on the Hollywood side.